I gave this company everything I had, every ounce of energy, every weekend, every late night where I sat at my desk long after everyone else had gone home, thinking, planning, strategizing, pouring my heart into something that I genuinely believed was ours. I wasn't just an employee, not just someone showing up for a paycheck, because from the very beginning, when this business was nothing more than a failing idea my father and brother were desperately trying to salvage, I had been the one to step in, to organize the chaos, to turn what was barely surviving into something that thrived. I had built client relationships from scratch, turned one-time contracts into long-term partnerships, developed marketing strategies that took us from an unknown operation to a respected name in our industry, and somehow, despite all of that, they still had the audacity to look me in the eye and tell me that it had never really been mine. I still remember the early days, the way my father had sat at the kitchen table, flipping through unpaid invoices with a look of quiet desperation, my brother pacing behind him, muttering about how they just needed one good break, one solid contract to turn things around, and I, fresh out of college, young and eager, had made the mistake of believing that if I stepped in to help, I would become part of something real, something permanent, something that would belong to all of us. I didn't ask for a salary at first, didn't expect anything in return other than the understanding that my work, my dedication, my sacrifices would earn me a rightful place in the business as it grew. And grow it did, faster than any of us had expected, because I knew how to build something sustainable, knew how to foster trust with clients, knew how to take an idea and turn it into a structured, thriving enterprise. For years, I worked harder than anyone else, harder than my brother, who spent more time networking at expensive dinners than actually managing operations, harder than my father, who still treated the business like it was operating out of a garage, refusing to adapt to the scale we had reached. I was the one handling contracts, smoothing over issues with clients when my brother's arrogance nearly lost them, ensuring that deadlines were met when my father hesitated on decisions, putting out fires they never even saw coming. I had earned my place, carved out my role through sheer determination, and I never once thought to question whether or not they saw me as an equal. I assumed, naively, that family meant fairness, that shared blood meant shared success, that when the business finally hit the level we
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
had always dreamed of, there would be no debate about my position in it. The moment everything changed was so simple, so unassuming, that I almost didn't catch it at first. We had just landed the biggest contract of our careers, a multi-million-dollar deal that secured our financial future, and I had sat across from my father and brother in our conference room, expecting to discuss the next steps, expecting, finally, to be given the formal stake in the company that I had earned 100 times over. But when I brought it up, when I casually mentioned finalizing my partnership agreement, my father had simply exchanged a glance with my brother, let out a short sigh, and delivered the words that would unravel everything I had believed in. "You were just helping. It was never yours." At first, I thought I had misheard, thought that maybe I was misunderstanding, that maybe there was some kind of miscommunication that could be cleared up with a conversation. But when I looked at my brother, expecting him to correct our father, expecting him to say something, anything, that would reassure me that this was a mistake, all he did was shrug, like this was the most obvious thing in the world. "You never invested anything," he said, as if the years of my time, effort, and expertise weren't worth more than any dollar amount. "You were helping us out. That's not the same as owning something." I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt too thick, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake, and for a long, painful moment, I just sat there, staring at the two people I had spent years believing were my partners, my family, the people I had trusted with my future, realizing that they had never once seen me as their equal. I had been nothing more than a convenient tool, someone to lighten their workload, someone to clean up their messes, someone to carry the business forward without ever expecting a real seat at the table. I could have fought them, could have argued, could have demanded what was rightfully mine, but in that moment, something inside me hardened, something that had been slowly cracking for years finally breaking completely. I saw them for who they really were, users, opportunists, men who had built their success off my back and never once intended to acknowledge it. And if they thought I was just going to accept that, just going to keep working for them like some employee they could dismiss whenever it was convenient, then they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I stood up without another word, my movements slow, deliberate, calculated, because I knew that anything I said in that moment would be wasted on them, knew that they had already made up their minds, knew that they didn't think I had any power in this situation. But they had underestimated me. They had assumed that because I hadn't fought for a formal stake in the business before, that I would simply accept this as my reality, that I would roll over and let them erase me like I had never been there. But they had forgotten something. I was the one who had built the client relationships. I was the one the clients trusted. I was the one who had their emails, their numbers, their contracts, their loyalty. And if I had been just helping, if my work had never truly mattered, then surely they wouldn't notice when I was gone. I walked out of that office with my head held high, not bothering to say goodbye, not bothering to look back, because I knew something they didn't. They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I sat across from them, my father watching me with that calm, unreadable expression he always wore when he expected me to fall in line, my brother leaning back in his chair with a kind of smug confidence that told me he thought the conversation was over, that he had won, that I would simply accept what they had decided for me without a fight. I could feel the anger simmering beneath my skin, burning in the back of my throat, clawing at my ribs, but I didn't let it show, didn't let a single flicker of emotion betray what was really going through my mind, because I knew that if I lashed out now, if I let them see even a glimpse of the betrayal, the hurt, the absolute rage that was twisting inside me, they would assume they had the upper hand, that I was just being emotional, that I would get over it and come crawling back when I realized that I had nowhere else to go. So I forced a small, measured smile, nodded once, and let out a slow breath as if I was letting go of something instead of gripping onto a new, sharper kind of resolve. I understand, I said, keeping my voice light, even, as if this was nothing more than a minor disappointment, as if I wasn't standing at the edge of a decision that would change everything. My brother's smirk deepened, his fingers tapping lazily against the desk, already dismissing me, already moving on, already so sure that I wouldn't dare do anything about what they had just taken from me. My father, ever the quiet observer, studied me for a second longer, his expression unreadable, his mouth pressing into a thin line like he wasn't entirely convinced this was over, but he didn't say a word to stop me as I stood up and straightened my blazer, smoothing down non-existent wrinkles with slow, deliberate movements. They thought I was backing down. They thought I was accepting my place. They thought I was walking away with nothing. They were wrong. I spent the next week tying up loose ends, pretending to finish off projects, pretending to prepare a smooth transition for whoever would step into my role, pretending to be cooperative and professional and gracious as I smiled through conversations with the very people who had made it clear I had no real place in what I had built. But beneath that surface, behind the polite nods and the calm facade, I was securing something far more valuable than any title, something they had been too arrogant to realize I had full control over, something they had foolishly assumed didn't matter. The client list. Not just names and numbers, not just contact emails or spreadsheets, but relationships, years of trust, of personal connections, of quiet conversations over coffee where I learned exactly what each of them wanted, what frustrated them, what kept them loyal, what made them hesitate, what made them leave. These weren't just numbers on a sales report, weren't just faceless accounts in a system. They were people who trusted me, who answered my calls, who came to me when they had concerns, who relied on me to make sure things ran smoothly, to make sure their needs were met, to make sure the business we were providing them actually worked for them. And my father and brother? They had no idea just how much of that loyalty had nothing to do with the company and everything to do with me. I didn't take a single piece of paper with me, didn't steal a single document, didn't need to do anything that could legally tie me to some petty act of revenge, because I didn't need to. Every number, every contact, every small detail that made the difference between a satisfied client and one looking for an excuse to leave, it was all already in my head, woven into the years of work I had done, imprinted in every conversation, every negotiation, every problem I had solved before it ever reached my brother's desk. On my last day, I walked through the office one final time, taking in the space I had once thought of as my second home, the business I had once believed I was building for all of us, the future I had spent years investing in only to realize too late that I was never meant to have a real stake in it. My father barely looked up when I passed his office, his focus on whatever papers were in front of him, as if he had already moved on, as if my departure was nothing more than an administrative formality. My brother stood by the reception desk, chatting easily with a couple of employees, grinning like he had won something, like he had pushed me out and come out on top, like he had taken what he wanted without consequence. I met his eyes for half a second, just long enough to let a slow, knowing smile stretch across my face, a smile that wasn't bitter, wasn't sad, wasn't angry, just calm, composed, and quietly victorious in a way that he didn't understand yet. He frowned slightly, confused by the lack of fight, the lack of desperation, the lack of anything that would tell him I was upset, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of an explanation. I just turned, pushed open the glass doors, and stepped out into the crisp evening air, feeling the weight of something heavy and final settle in my chest as the doors shut behind me. They thought I would regret leaving. They thought I would struggle without them. They thought I had lost. They had no idea what was coming. I had always known that the foundation of our business was built on something far more fragile than my father and brother ever wanted to admit, something that wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet or quarterly reports, but about trust, about relationships, about the simple fact that people don't stay loyal to a company. They stay loyal to the people who make them feel valued. That was the thing my father never understood and my brother never cared about, the thing they had taken for granted because they assumed that once a client signed a contract, they would stay indefinitely, as if business relationships were built on nothing more than signatures and fine print instead of mutual respect and reliability. And that was exactly why I didn't have to steal a single file, didn't have to take a single document, didn't have to lift a finger to sabotage them, because they had already done that to themselves the moment they decided that I wasn't a necessary part of what they had built. I didn't make any grand moves, didn't send out mass emails, didn't launch some aggressive campaign to pull clients away, because I didn't have to. All I did was send a few simple messages, quiet, friendly, unobtrusive, the kind of messages that wouldn't raise suspicion but would plant just enough of a seed to let nature take its course. Hey, just wanted to check in. Hope all is well on your end. I won't be with the company anymore, but if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. That was all it took. Nothing pushy, nothing demanding, nothing even remotely questionable, just a soft reminder that I was still out there, that I was still the same person they had trusted for years, the same person who had fixed their problems before they even had to ask, the same person who had made sure they got what they needed when my brother couldn't be bothered to take their calls. And then I waited. It didn't take long for the first crack to appear, didn't take long for the first quiet ripples of doubt to start spreading, because the second people started realizing that I wasn't there anymore, the second they realized that the person they actually relied on had walked away, the second they started calling the office only to get my brother's empty reassurances or my father's polite but distant responses, they started to think, really think, about whether or not this company was still worth their loyalty. And then, just like I knew it would, the first domino fell. The call came 3 weeks after I left, late in the afternoon on a Thursday, when I was sitting in my tiny new office, a space that wasn't impressive or flashy but was mine, completely and entirely mine, no strings attached, no one standing over my shoulder telling me what I was worth. The number flashing on my phone was familiar, one of our oldest clients, a company that had been with us since the very beginning, the kind of contract my father and brother had always considered safe, something they assumed would never go anywhere because of history, because of comfort, because of the misguided belief that loyalty was something permanent instead of something that had to be earned over and over again. Hey, it's been a while, the voice on the other end said, warm, familiar, the same easy tone we had always used in our conversations, but there was something underneath it now, something thoughtful, something cautious, something that told me he wasn't just calling to catch up. I heard you left the company. Just wanted to check in, see what you were up to. I leaned back in my chair, letting a small smile tug at the corner of my lips, because I knew exactly where this was going, exactly how this conversation would play out, exactly what was about to happen. Yeah, things didn't work out. I said casually, not bitter, not resentful, just a quiet, simple statement of fact, because that was all it needed to be. Decided it was time to move on to something new. There was a pause on the other end, a thoughtful silence that stretched just long enough to confirm what I already knew, and then came the question I had been waiting for. So, tell me, what exactly are you doing now? By the end of that phone call, I had my first new contract. The loss wasn't massive, wasn't some earth-shattering blow that would immediately cripple the company, but it was noticeable, a crack in the foundation, a warning sign that my father and brother would have been smart to take seriously. But they didn't. My brother, ever arrogant, ever dismissive of anything that didn't immediately set off alarms, waved it off as nothing more than a random market issue, an unavoidable fluctuation, just a normal part of doing business. My father, ever the quiet strategist, wasn't so sure, wasn't so quick to brush it off, wasn't as convinced that this was just some passing inconvenience, but even he didn't have the full picture yet, didn't realize that this wasn't some isolated event. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would unravel everything they thought was secure. I didn't reach out to the other clients. I didn't have to, because once one domino falls, the rest start to wobble on their own. I sat back, watching from a distance, not gloating, not celebrating, not even needing to do anything more than wait, because I knew exactly what was coming. They had built a business on the assumption that I was replaceable, that my work had been just another piece of the puzzle instead of the foundation that had kept everything together. But what they didn't understand, what they had never understood, was that once a foundation starts to crack, it doesn't stop until everything comes crashing down. That was the smallest client. Let's see how they handle the big ones. It didn't take long for word to spread. Didn't take long for the clients who had trusted me for years to start realizing that things weren't quite the same without me there. Didn't take long for the uneasy murmurs to turn into quiet doubts, and for those doubts to turn into something much more dangerous for my father and brother, hesitation. Business relationships are fragile things, built on more than just contracts and invoices, built on trust, on the knowledge that when something goes wrong, there's someone on the other end who actually cares enough to fix it, someone who isn't just pushing paperwork and collecting payments but actually invested in making sure things work. And for years, that someone had been me. The first few losses had been subtle, just a couple of clients quietly backing away, just a few emails going unanswered, just a couple of payments getting delayed because suddenly people weren't in a rush to send money to a company they weren't sure could still deliver. But then, like a slow-moving avalanche, the losses started piling up, gathering momentum, building into something my brother and father couldn't ignore, something that made them realize, far too late, that they had completely underestimated just how much of the company's success had been tied to me. I imagine the moment my brother first noticed the real damage. Imagine the way his confidence must have faltered for the first time in years when he looked at the numbers and saw the undeniable truth staring back at him. I imagine the irritation in his voice as he tried to brush it off, convincing himself that it was just a temporary slump, that it was nothing more than a coincidence, that things would even out if they just pushed a little harder, made a few more calls, reeled in a few more clients. And I imagine the moment he realized that no matter what he did, the numbers kept dropping, the contracts kept disappearing, and the clients weren't answering the way they used to. When his number appeared on my phone screen one afternoon, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me, however, was the tone of his voice when I finally picked up, the sudden forced friendliness, the awkward attempt at sounding casual, the way he hesitated for just a second too long before saying my name like he wasn't quite sure how to start the conversation. This was the same brother who had spent years dismissing my work, the same brother who had looked me in the eye and told me that I was just helping, the same brother who had smirked at me when I walked out of the office, fully convinced that I would come crawling back once I realized how much I needed them. And yet here he was calling me, reaching out like none of that had ever happened, like we were just two old colleagues catching up, like he hadn't completely erased me from the company the moment it suited him. "Hey," he said, his voice overly casual, forced in a way that made my lips curl into an amused smile. "Been a while, huh?" I leaned back in my chair, glancing at my laptop where a fresh contract from yet another former client of theirs sat waiting for my signature, another quiet victory in the slow, inevitable downfall they had set in motion themselves. "Yeah," I said, matching his casual tone, "it really has." There was a pause, a moment of hesitation, like he was waiting for me to fill in the silence, to give him something to work with, to make this conversation easier for him. But I didn't. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable, just long enough for him to realize that I wasn't going to make this easy. So, listen, he finally said, clearing his throat. We've been having a few issues with some of the accounts. Just some hiccups, nothing major, you know how it is. But I figured I'd reach out, see how you've been, see what you've been up to. I almost laughed at the sheer transparency of it, at the way he was so obviously trying to act like this was just a friendly chat, like he wasn't reaching out because he was slowly starting to realize that he had made a mistake, like he wasn't sitting there panicking over the fact that his hiccups were quickly turning into something much bigger than he could handle. Oh, I said, my voice light, innocent, deliberately playing into his game. That's surprising. I thought everything was fine over there. I mean, you guys made it pretty clear that I was just helping, so I assumed it wouldn't make much of a difference when I left. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the silence stretching just long enough for me to know that my words had landed exactly the way I wanted them to. Come on, he said after a moment, his tone shifting just slightly, the irritation creeping in around the edges now. You know that's not what I meant. We've just had some unexpected challenges, that's all. You know how business is. I could hear it now, the cracks in his confidence, the subtle hint of desperation he was trying so hard to hide, the unspoken, we need you, lingering just beneath the surface of his words. And it was almost funny, really, how quickly things had shifted, how easily the dynamic had flipped, how the same brother who had dismissed me so effortlessly just a few months ago was now scrambling to keep his business from falling apart. Yeah, I said finally, letting my voice remain calm, composed, unaffected. I do know how business is. And then, before he could say anything else, before he could try to steer the conversation into whatever pathetic offer he was about to make, before he could convince himself that there was still a chance to fix this, I ended the call. The business was bleeding money. The cracks were turning into fractures. The panic was setting in. And they still thought they could fix this. They were wrong. I had always known that my father was the kind of man who stayed silent until he had no other choice, the kind of man who let things spiral out of control while convincing himself that everything was still salvageable, the kind of man who would rather watch the walls crumble around him than admit that he had made a mistake. So when I finally saw his name flash across my phone screen, I knew, without a doubt, that things had finally reached a point where he could no longer afford to ignore them. He wasn't calling to check in, wasn't calling to make amends, wasn't calling to ask how I was doing. He was calling because, for the first time, he was worried. The company was bleeding out faster than either of them had anticipated, clients walking away in steady waves, contracts being pulled with vague explanations about restructuring or budget reevaluations, the kind of corporate excuses that translated into exactly what I already knew. Nobody trusted them anymore. It wasn't that I had taken anyone from them, wasn't that I had done anything underhanded, wasn't that I had gone out of my way to destroy what they had built. I hadn't needed to. They had done that all on their own by assuming that clients were nothing more than numbers in a ledger, by treating them like static figures instead of relationships that needed to be nurtured, by believing, arrogantly, that I had been nothing more than an extra set of hands instead of the person who had held everything together. I let the phone ring for a few seconds longer than necessary before answering, making him wait just long enough to remind him that I no longer had to jump whenever he called, that I no longer owed him my time, that I no longer had any reason to make things easier for him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than I expected, lacking its usual certainty, its usual calm authority, as if he had finally begun to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had miscalculated this entire situation. We need to talk, he said, not wasting time on pleasantries, not bothering with the usual small talk, because he knew, as well as I did, that this wasn't a social call. I leaned back in my chair, glancing around my new office, the one I had paid for with my own money, the one that didn't have his name on the lease, the one that didn't belong to anyone but me. Oh, I said, keeping my voice light, feigning curiosity, even though I already knew exactly what he was going to say. What about? He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to confirm what I suspected, that he didn't know how to approach me anymore, didn't know how to manipulate the conversation in the way he always had before, didn't know how to make me fall back into line the way I always used to. The business is struggling, he admitted finally, the words slow, careful, as if saying them too quickly would make them more real. We've lost some major accounts. We're trying to figure out what's causing it. I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of his wording, at the way he framed the situation as though it was some great mystery, as though the answer wasn't sitting right in front of him, staring him in the face, as though he hadn't stood in front of me weeks ago and told me to my face that I had never really mattered. That's tough, I said, my tone deliberately neutral, offering nothing, giving him no indication that I cared one way or another. I hope you figure it out. There was a long, heavy pause, the kind that carried the weight of unspoken truths, the kind that made it painfully obvious that he was waiting for me to offer a solution, to step in and fix things the way I always had before. But I didn't. I let the silence stretch until he was the one who cracked first. Your brother thinks we should sue you, he said finally, the words clipped, reluctant, forced out as if he already knew how ridiculous they sounded even as he said them. He thinks you're interfering with our business, thinks you're going after our clients. That made me laugh, a short, sharp sound that slipped out before I could stop it, because the sheer delusion of it was almost too much to process. Suing me for what, exactly? I asked, genuinely curious as to what absurd legal argument my brother had cooked up in his desperate attempt to salvage what was left of their sinking ship. For existing? For having conversations? For running my own business? For poaching our clients, he said, but there was no conviction behind it, no real belief in the words, because even he knew it was a lie. Even he knew that I hadn't done anything more than take my rightful place in the industry I had helped build. I didn't steal anyone, I said, my voice calm, even unwavering. I just gave people what they actually needed. And that was the truth. I hadn't begged, hadn't pushed, hadn't used underhanded tactics to pull anyone away from them. The clients who had left had done so because they had seen the cracks in the foundation, had realized that the people left in charge weren't capable of giving them what they needed, had recognized that without me there, the business wasn't what it used to be. I hadn't taken anything from them. They had just lost it. You're ruining us, my brother spat, his voice suddenly cutting through the speaker, sharp, bitter, full of resentment that was entirely his own making. You did this on purpose. You're trying to destroy everything we worked for. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head, feeling nothing but an overwhelming sense of finality, of closure, of the realization that this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where they finally understood that they had never really held any power over me at all. Ruining it? I repeated, letting the words settle between us, letting them feel the weight of what I was about to say. No. I just took back what I built. And with that, I hung up the phone. The call came late in the evening, long after I had finished work for the day, long after I had settled into the comfort of knowing that I had built something of my own, something they could never take from me, something that was finally, truly mine. When I saw my father's name on the screen, I almost didn't answer, almost let it ring until it went to voicemail, because I already knew exactly why he was calling, already knew that this wasn't going to be some heartfelt apology, wasn't going to be some admission of guilt, wasn't going to be anything more than an attempt to pull me back into a situation that was already beyond saving. But against my better judgment, against every instinct telling me that there was nothing left to say, I answered anyway, pressing the phone to my ear with a quiet, steady breath, bracing myself for whatever words were about to come. I want to talk, my father said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it before, stripped of the usual authority, the usual certainty, the usual unwavering confidence that had once made me believe he was incapable of making mistakes. Not about the past, not about what happened, just about moving forward. I almost laughed at that, almost let the bitterness slip through, because the sheer irony of those words was impossible to ignore. He didn't want to talk about the past, didn't want to talk about what had happened, didn't want to acknowledge the betrayal, the dismissal, the years I had poured into something that had never really been mine. He just wanted to talk about moving forward, as if moving forward didn't require admitting what had already been done, as if I was supposed to ignore the fact that he had stood by and watched as I was cast aside like an afterthought, as if I was supposed to pretend that I hadn't spent weeks watching them struggle, waiting for the moment they would finally realize that they needed me more than I had ever needed them. I'm listening, I said finally, keeping my tone neutral, not giving him the satisfaction of knowing how much I already anticipated the direction of this conversation. There was a long pause, just a second too long, just enough time for me to hear the weight in his breath, the unspoken hesitation, the quiet confirmation that whatever he was about to say wasn't going to be easy for him. My father was not the kind of man who admitted failure easily, not the kind of man who reached out unless he absolutely had to, not the kind of man who called his daughter late at night unless he had run out of other options. "We need you back," he said finally, the words slow, careful, deliberate. "Not just for us, not just for the business, but because you know how to fix this. You know how to handle the clients, how to rebuild their trust, how to do the things your brother was never good at. You know this company better than anyone. You always have." I let those words settle between us, let them stretch out into the silence, let him sit with the weight of them as I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the city lights below, feeling nothing but the quiet certainty that I had been waiting for this moment since the day I walked away. "You want me to come back?" I said slowly, as if testing the words, as if trying to see if they tasted any different when spoken aloud. "Yes," he said, a little too quickly, a little too eager, as if he thought that was all it would take, as if he thought the mere offer of returning would be enough to undo everything that had already been done. "As an owner?" I asked, my voice calm, measured, knowing the answer before he even had the chance to say it, knowing that this was the part he hadn't figured out how to navigate yet. Another pause. A long one. "We can't do that," he said finally, the hesitation thick in his voice, the discomfort evident in the way he stumbled over the words, the way he tried to soften them as if that would make them easier to accept. "Not right now, not with everything that's happened. But we can offer you a senior position, something with real authority, real influence. You'll have control over the client relationships, over the strategic direction of the company. You'll be an employee." I finished for him, cutting through his carefully chosen words, slicing straight to the truth he was trying to avoid. "You want me to come back, to clean up your mess, to save your business, to rebuild everything you let fall apart, but not as an equal, not as a partner, not as someone with any real stake in what I helped create. Just as an employee." He didn't answer right away, and that silence was all I needed to hear. "You already decided I wasn't part of this business," I said finally, my voice steady, unwavering, leaving no room for doubt. "You don't get to change your mind now." I could hear him inhale sharply, could hear the frustration bubbling beneath the surface, could hear the weight of his own mistake pressing down on him, but I didn't care, didn't feel the slightest urge to soften the truth for him, didn't feel the need to make this easier than it had to be. He had made his choice. They both had. And now they were learning the hard way that choices had consequences. "This is your home," he said, the words quieter now, almost pleading, as if trying to appeal to something that no longer existed inside me. "We built this together. You belong here." I let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking my head even though he couldn't see it. "No," I said, the finality in my tone cutting through the distance between us like a knife. "I built it. You just took the credit." I let the silence stretch for a moment longer, let him sit with the weight of what he had lost, let him feel the full weight of the decision they had made when they pushed me aside. "But don't worry," I added, my voice light, almost amused now. "I'll see you around. Your former clients have been keeping me very busy." And then, without waiting for a response, I hung up the phone. The news came to me in bits and pieces, through whispers in the industry, through offhand comments from former colleagues, through the quiet satisfaction in the voices of clients who had once hesitated to leave, but now spoke freely about how things had changed since I left, about how things had begun to unravel faster than anyone had expected. Their company, the one I had helped build, the one they had so confidently claimed was never mine, was barely staying afloat, struggling under the weight of lost contracts, missed deadlines, and a growing reputation that painted them as unreliable, untrustworthy, and completely incapable of managing the business they had once thought they could run without me. At first, the damage had been slow, almost unnoticeable, just a small shift in momentum, just a few clients walking away, just a minor dip in revenue that could be brushed off as a temporary setback. But then, as weeks turned into months, The reality became impossible to ignore, the losses mounting faster than they could recover, the cracks in their foundation widening until entire sections of the business began crumbling before their eyes. The loans they had taken out to expand, the ones they had assumed would be easy to pay off as long as the contracts kept coming in, were now overdue, the payments stacking up while their revenue continued to plummet. Employees, the ones who had once been loyal because they had believed in the stability of the company, had started looking elsewhere, jumping ship before things got worse, leaving behind empty desks and unfinished projects that no one had the time or experience to handle. And the clients, the ones they had assumed would never leave, the ones they had thought were bound by long-standing contracts, the ones they had once dismissed as easily replaceable, had gone silent, their emails unanswered, their payments delayed, their patience worn thin by excuse after excuse, until eventually, they stopped coming back altogether. Through it all, my brother had been the loudest voice in the room, his frustration spilling over into anger, his carefully constructed confidence cracking under the pressure of a reality he refused to accept. He blamed the market, blamed the clients, blamed the employees who left, blamed the changing economy, blamed everything and everyone except for the one undeniable truth staring him in the face, that he was the problem, that he had never been capable of running this business, that he had only ever been successful because I had been there to carry the weight he never even realized he was placing on my shoulders. I heard from people who still worked there, people who had been keeping their heads down, trying to survive in the chaos, that the tension inside the office was unbearable now, that meetings were nothing more than shouting matches, that my brother had turned into a storm of resentment and desperation, lashing out at employees, at vendors, at anyone who dared to suggest that the company's problems might not be external, that maybe, just maybe, the failure was coming from within. But my father? He had gone quiet. The man who had once ruled the office with calm authority, who had once believed himself to be the steady force that held everything together, had begun to withdraw, speaking less, sitting in his office for hours at a time, staring at spreadsheets that told the same story no matter how many times he looked at them. He had started looking old, they told me, like the weight of the company's downfall was pressing into his bones, like he was finally beginning to understand what he had lost, what he had thrown away, what he had let slip through his fingers the moment he decided that my work, my time, my sacrifices had never really mattered. Meanwhile, I was thriving. I hadn't needed to steal their clients, hadn't needed to engage in some bitter battle for control, hadn't needed to do anything except step aside and let their own incompetence finish what they had started. My own firm, the one I had built from the ground up, the one that had my name on the door, was growing faster than I had ever expected, drawing in new business not just from old clients but from companies that had been watching from the sidelines, waiting to see what I would do next. They came to me because they trusted me, because they had seen what I was capable of, because they knew that my success wasn't built on arrogance or nepotism or blind entitlement, but on years of experience, on relationships I had nurtured, on skills I had sharpened through actual work instead of empty talk. And the best part? I hadn't even needed to reach out to most of them. They had found me, had sought me out, had chosen me over the company that had once assumed it was untouchable. I could have felt bad for them, could have taken some kind of pity on the fact that they were now barely holding on, could have seen my father's silence and my brother's unraveling as reasons to step in, to offer something, to remind them that it didn't have to be this way. But I didn't, because they had made their choices. And now, they were living with the consequences. They thought I needed them. Turns out, it was the other way around. It was late in the afternoon when the knock came, sharp and insistent against the heavy wood of my office door, the kind of knock that carried a familiar impatience, the kind that belonged to someone who had spent his entire life assuming that people would always open doors for him, that conversations would always go his way, that problems would always be solved by someone else. I didn't have to look up to know who it was, didn't have to check the security camera feed or ask my assistant to confirm, because there was only one person who would show up here unannounced, only one person who had run out of other options, only one person who had finally realized far too late that I had never been the one who needed them. I let him wait. I could hear him shifting impatiently outside, probably glancing at his phone, probably debating whether or not to knock again, probably wondering why I wasn't already at the door, ready to listen, ready to forgive, ready to give him the second chance he had never once considered giving me. But I took my time, deliberately finishing the email I had been writing, deliberately letting him feel, for the first time in his life, what it was like to not be the most important person in the room, to not have the upper hand, to not be in control of the situation. When I finally opened the door, he looked different, not quite as polished as he usually did, not quite as sure of himself, not quite as put together in the way he had always been when things were going his way. His suit was still expensive, still tailored, but there was something almost off about it, something that made it clear he had been wearing it for too long, that it was no longer a symbol of effortless wealth, but a reminder of what he was desperately trying to hold on to. "We need to talk," he said, and for the first time in my life, there was no arrogance in his tone, no condescension, no carefully disguised superiority, just desperation, just uncertainty, just the quiet, sinking knowledge that he had nowhere else to go. I didn't step aside to let him in. "We don't have anything to talk about," I said simply, keeping my voice calm, keeping my expression neutral, keeping every ounce of satisfaction I felt buried beneath something unreadable, because I wanted him to know that I wasn't angry anymore, that I wasn't even bitter, that I had already moved so far past this moment that it didn't even hold weight for me anymore. He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head like he couldn't believe I was actually standing there, actually making him work for this, actually refusing to just fix it for him the way I had always done before. "Look, I know things got out of hand," he started, already shifting into negotiation mode, already trying to frame things as if they had been nothing more than a misunderstanding, as if it had all just been some unfortunate business decision that had gotten a little too personal. "I know you're doing well on your own, and I respect that, but the truth is, we're in trouble. The company isn't going to survive if something doesn't change, and honestly, I think the best thing for both of us is to just put the past behind us and move forward together." I let him talk, let him lay out his carefully worded offer, let him go through every version of the same tired argument I had already heard from my father, the same manipulative appeal to family, to loyalty, to the idea that this was bigger than all of us, that we had built this together, that I had some moral obligation to come back and help them fix the disaster they had created. And then, when he finally stopped talking, when he finally looked at me like he was waiting for an answer, I just shook my head and let out a slow, steady breath. "You never saw me as an equal," I said, my voice even, my expression unchanged. "You just needed someone to clean up your mess." He stiffened slightly, his jaw tightening, his shoulders tensing, like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to fight, like he wanted to tell me that I was wrong, but we both knew I wasn't. We both knew that this wasn't about anything more than the fact that he had run out of options, that he had backed himself into a corner, that he had realized, too late, that he had made the single biggest mistake of his life. "So that's it?" he asked finally, his voice quiet now, strained, almost genuine in a way I had never heard before. "You're just going to let us fail?" I smiled then, just slightly, just enough to let him know that there was no hatred left in me, no anger, no lingering need to prove anything, just the cold, simple reality of the choice they had made. "You already did," I said, and then, before he could say anything else, before he could try to twist the conversation into something else, before he could try to make me responsible for fixing what he had broken, I stepped back inside and closed the door in his face. Later that night, after the office was quiet, after the world had settled into its usual stillness, I checked my email one last time before heading home, expecting nothing more than the usual messages, the usual updates, the usual flow of business that had nothing to do with them anymore. But sitting there, at the top of my inbox, was an email with no subject line, sent from an address I hadn't seen in months. It was from my father. There was no greeting, no long-winded explanation, no attempt to justify or defend what had happened. Just one simple sentence, one quiet acknowledgement of something that had been true all along. "I should have given you what you earned." I stared at the words for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, my mind running through every version of a response I could have sent, every bitter remark, every quiet dismissal, every chance to tell him that it didn't matter anymore. But in the end, I didn't respond at all. "Maybe," I whispered to myself, closing my laptop, standing up, turning off the light, feeling nothing but the quiet certainty of knowing I had finally let go.
But now?
It's too late.